everyone. My name is Alex Friedman. I'm a managing director and partner at BCG, supporting our private equity, consumer, and digital businesses. A bit about me: before coming to BCG, I actually co-founded and built a company called Lola that addresses the need for ingredient transparency in women's personal care products. And at BCG, I work with our clients on solving some of their toughest challenges, and I'm also part of a multidisciplinary research team that works to study the current and future spending power of women in the US and drive towards solutions to close the women's health and wealth gap in the US once and for all. And it's known as the Innovate Her program at BCG. I'm excited to be here on stage with our North America chair, Sharon Marcil. Sharon was on this stage a year ago speaking to the care economy, and that research actually was part of an executive order that President Biden presented since that day. And Sharon oversees our North America business and 12,000 colleagues in Mexico, the US, and Canada. Sharon previously oversaw our consumer practice, and after that, our public sector practice. And we're here today to speak to a topic near and dear to both of us: the economic potential and power of women in the US. Hi, Sharon.
Hi, Alex. It's great to be here with you today. Thanks so much for being on stage with me. This is such a great group of women. It's a pleasure to be here. And you talked a little bit about the care economy. I had the pleasure of being here last year where we talked about the care economy, but today we'll talk about an equally important topic, which is the wealth gap and the health gap in terms of women in the United States.
That's right. And Sharon, we're at the Global Women's Summit. Everyone in this room is incredibly invested and excited about building solutions and services for women. You know, I can't think of a more fitting stage to be on than this one, and I can't think of a more fitting city to be in today, the day after Jill Biden announced the first ever White House initiative focused on clinical research and women's health. So really excited about that progress. And as you mentioned, the two areas of focus today are the gaps, the gender gaps in health and wealth.
Yeah. And you mentioned, Alex, I ran the consumer practice, so that was many years ago in BCG. But in 2009, BCG did a piece of seminal research where we surveyed 12,000 women across the US, and we looked at every industry area. And we looked at what were the gaps and unfilled needs of women across every industry area. And the two laggards were financial institutions and also healthcare. And so what you saw in terms of financial institutions was products that didn't quite fit, and then messages that didn't resonate and even sometimes were stereotypical. And interestingly, in the health realm, what we saw was women were less satisfied than men, particularly middle-aged women. So there was a real gap. Now you fast forward to now, many of those gaps still exist, and we can talk a little bit about what that looks like and then also the opportunity. But I still think, as we sit here today, there's enormous opportunity.
That's great, Sharon. You know, I hear you. There's a ton of progress that has been made, but definitely there's way more that we can be doing to close these gaps.
Yeah, there's so much more that we can be doing to close these gaps. So let me talk a little bit about the wealth side. So if you look at baby boomers and those households, 40% of investment decisions are made by women. If you look at millennial households, 70% of the investment decisions are made by women. Having said that, if you double click onto that, there's still a confidence gap in terms of women. So only 28% of women making those investments are fully confident that they're making the right investment. So what do you see? You see that actually women are more conservative in the investments that they make. They invest in lower return vehicles than men do, and that impacts actually returns and wealth accumulation. Interestingly, it's also reflective of the industry. So if you look at wealth advisors, 70% of wealth advisors today are still men, only 30% are women. So that's thinking about personal wealth. If you expand it and you think about the economy, BCG partners with an organization called the First Women's Bank. It's based in Chicago. It was incorporated in 2021. And the insight that First Women's Bank had was that only 16% of all commercial loans went to women. And that only represented 4% of the total capital. So in working with First Women's Bank, BCG did a piece of research that said if women globally had the same access to capital as men, what could that generate in terms of economic impact? And the number is 2.1 trillion. So there's enormous opportunity at an individual household level and then also at a macro level.
That resonates deeply. The scale of it is incredible. I remember when I was an entrepreneur on the VC circuit, trying to raise capital for my female-founded, female-focused brand, just trying to explain the investment opportunity to investors and why it was so important to back a female-forward business. The gap was massive just to try to get that across in those rooms as we were raising capital. To me, it felt like maybe I was doing something that the message wasn't landing. Maybe it was the way that we were telling the story, but what we learned over time and what we really felt was that it was actually a systemic issue, and that was why it was so hard to raise capital as a female founder.
I had the pleasure of interviewing Jenny Abramson recently. Jenny's based here in Washington, and she is the founder and CEO of the largest venture firm that backs women founders and women CEOs. And in that conversation, she and I discussed sort of her rationale for getting into that business. And she said, actually, 86% of the decision makers in venture capital today are men. And if you look at the money that flows to women that are starting new startup businesses, it's 2.1% of venture funding. And so again, looking at the gap, it's very much there. Now, on the positive, let me be positive for a moment. Rethink Impact had a new capital raise. It was oversubscribed. It was like a tremendous success, so that's terrific. And if you look at the data, I think what is being understood better today than it ever was before, women make great CEOs, particularly CEOs of startups. And why is that? Because they're actually really good stewards of money. And they're less likely, coming back to the risk point, to take huge risks in terms of that seed and startup money. So I think, we're starting to get to a place where hopefully we continue to see positive momentum.
Right, we're seeing the proof points. Okay, now Sharon, I want to switch over from wealth to health. What are you seeing in North America women's health?
Okay. So today, if you look at women's health spend overall, it's $9 billion, actually in 2021, not today. BCG Research forecasts that $9 billion will grow to $29 billion, which is terrific. That's a 220% increase in terms of funding of consumer health. Having said that, if you look at the total R&D dollars that is spent against women's healthcare, today it's 4%. And that includes in major disease areas, cardiovascular, mental health, cancer research. There's a real gap to the spend in men's research, even though there's an acknowledgement that there are real biological differences. What that means, Alex, is that if you look at something like adverse reactions to drugs, in many cases, you can see women having 3 times the adverse reactions and misdiagnosis. So if you're a woman going into the hospital in many places across the US with a heart attack, you're 25% more likely to be misdiagnosed. So to the positive, some positive trends, but also the bar that we're coming from is quite low.
Those are some incredible stats. I mean, when we think about kind of bridging wealth to health, when we think about the amount of capital that's flowing into women's hands paired with that trend line and new guidance and information coming into women's hands with the power already held in consumer spending, it feels like the sky's the limit here.
Well, you say the power in consumer spending. So if you look at women and healthcare decisions, women control 80% of the healthcare decisions for their families, and they're great stewards of funds, and they make great decisions for their families. So, click, that's an important fact. And again, on the optimist side of me, I mean, you look at the funding in terms of VC funding, PE funding. There was, $3.3 billion, I think, of PE funding that went into women's health. There's 1,200 new startups in the women's health area, which you're deeply familiar with, which is across 17 life stages of women. So there's momentum. And I think what BCG thinks is that over the next 10 years, we're going to see some real breakthroughs in terms of women's health due to this investment level in the area of fertility, in the area of menopause, in the area of pregnancy. So there's hope on the horizon.
That's exactly right. I wanted to double click on one stat you said, which is that 4% of R&D goes to women's health. I remember when I started my business in the menstrual care category, there had been no clinical studies done on tampons ever, a product that had been on the market for decades, a FDA-regulated device that goes inside a woman's body a week, a month for 40 years. So to me, that was shocking. And I remember going into these pitch meetings with venture capitalists and having to actually explain why ingredients regulation was important in women's health. So if we had some of that data, it would have been a much easier sell, and I assume even more startups would be emerging.
Absolutely, no question about it, Alex.
But I definitely hear you when you say you're optimistic about the market. There are a lot of rich trends here and a lot of enthusiasm and money flowing in that direction, so we're excited to see that progress.
Yes.
I think we only have a minute or two left. I just wanted to quickly cover off on a couple of things that we think about at BCG that really is helping bend the trend for women's health and wealth, improving offerings. So the first thing to focus on here is product. Let's make sure that we have products that take the woman consumer in mind and we're building for her. Second is go-to-market and business. We're building businesses that actually have a marketing strategy geared to her and an operating model that services her. Services and operations, are we considering the end-to-end journey of the woman consumer, including customer service and speaking to her at every moment and servicing her in there? And then organization, is there woman representation at every level of the organization that's building products for her? And a stat that we talked about over the last couple of days is that only 5.6% of Fortune 500 CEOs are women. That's 28 people. So obviously, there's room to improve there too. Just wanted to quickly close it out. I think, when you're looking at the ecosystem and you're solving for women's health and wealth, there are lots of things that we in this room can be doing also, whether it's demanding more action from representatives to thinking about how we can ask more of our companies in supporting women's wealth and health. We're at BCG working with our clients day in and day out across industries and sectors, urgently trying to solve some of these issues, and there's really no one-size-fits-all or turnkey solution. We just are all coming at it from different angles, and we're looking forward to progress here. Sharon, I know that we could talk about these topics all day, but I think our time is up, so thank you, everyone. Please, if you want to learn more about the efforts that we're doing at BCG, you can go to www.bcg.com/x/innovate her. Thank you.
Thank you.